think we might get started. Thanks everybody for waiting. We'll get underway. First of all, on behalf of the Australian Research Council Centre of Excellence for Plant Success, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and the custodianship on the many lands on which we meet and pay our respects to their ancestors and descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. Recognise their valuable contributions to Australian and global society. And hello everyone, my name's Christine Beveridge and I'm the Director of the Centre of Plant Success, and it's my great pleasure to introduce Associate Professor Jenny Mortimer. Jenny's at the University of Adelaide and she is the Deputy Director of the Centre for Plants in Space, which is led out of the University of Adelaide. And she's also the Chief Investigator of a couple of other centres, the ARC Training Centre for Future Crops Development, which is about, her contribution is about agricultural biotechnology to develop resilient field crops. And she's also a CI in the ARC Research Hub for Engineering Plants to Replace Fossil Carbon, again relating to feedstocks for sustainable jet fuel. And I guess that jet fuel is needed to get plants in space. Jenny's also affiliate staff scientist at the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory in the US and Director of Plant Systems Biology at Joint Bioenergy Institute in the US. And, you know, her work covers a range of different things, from plant microbe interactions all the way to biomass crop production, and a really strong interest in synthetic biology and genetic molecular pathways involved in those processes mentioned. So there's a very wide range of reasons why we wanted to invite you, Jenny, to speak to us today. But I think you've also agreed to give us an overview of the Centre for Plants in Space. So I'll hand over to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Christine. Thank you for that very kind welcome. I'm just going to share my screen and hopefully get the right one. All right, hopefully you can see my full screen for my PowerPoint, okay? So,
yes, that's good, thanks.
Brilliant. Okay, so thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today and for that very kind introduction to come and speak to the Centre. As Christine mentioned, I've been involved in lots of different projects, but there's been really a fundamental kind of underlying piece for my research the whole time, which is how we can sort of continue to harness plants as we have throughout humanity to help us transition to a more sustainable sort of future. And one of the core parts of that is that we have, as society, is developing, and as we do that, we're putting more pressure on our environment. We're using up more resources, and I think we're all fairly cognizant of this idea that we have to think about what that future means. But we don't necessarily want to lose a quality of life. People still want to be able to eat sort of a high protein, high nutritious diet, or to have access to lots of different materials that we use to shape our lives. So the question is, can we use plants and other biological systems to kind of support that transition to what we call the bioeconomy? And while we've been doing that for a long time, some of the new technologies so think about sort of gene editing, CRISPR, our ability to manipulate and understand biological systems are kind of hopefully going to support us to do that. Although I'd say there's probably a lot of learnings before we can do it very effectively. But today, the first thing I also want to echo Christine's acknowledgement of country. I live and work on the lands of the Kaurna people here in the Adelaide Plains. And in particular, I want to acknowledge that deep connection that is between Indigenous culture and the stars. I mean, they were the first astronomers. And also particularly how that ability to link and to understand how the stars can be used to understand the plants and agriculture and harvesting around us. And I'm very conscious of the fact that we're building on that very long history of science and knowledge. And I know I'm kind of speaking to the converted here in this crowd, but I don't think it harms us to remember that on Earth, we rely on plants for so much. So I think food is the obvious one, but the oxygen we breathe is the output of photosynthesis. Much of the clothes we wear, if you think about cottons and other natural fabrics, building materials. And again, I think more recently, as we've thought about sustainability, people are revisiting the types of materials that are available to us. But many of our medications are derived from plants. Biofuels, I've worked for a long time on how we can develop sustainable biofuels that don't rely on food crops, but come from other biomass crops, heating. But really critically, it's not just about kind of those obvious end uses, but the idea that plants are important to us for our mental health, we take great pleasure in enjoying natural beauty, but also for growing plants in our gardens. Most people probably have a plant on their desk in their office or house plants at home. These are not sort of useful plants in the sense that you can necessarily eat them, but we take great delight in, or many people do, in tending them, looking after them, enjoying them. And the reason I think plants are incredible, the reason I've spent a long time studying them, is because they can make an array of products with just a sort of handful of ingredients. Take sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water, a few nutrients, process of photosynthesis, we get glucose and oxygen out. But to me, it's what happens after that, how the plant takes those sugars and makes this array of complex compounds. That, to me, is kind of a fascinating piece of biochemistry. But our ability to harness that's going to be really, really critical to our successful future. But today, I'm primarily going to talk to you about how this has worked in the last few years, and particularly that's gone into sort of developing this new center that I'll talk about later, is using space as a lens in which we can think about some of these questions, and how space is a fabulous way of trying to understand sustainability and needs, both there, but also on Earth. And that's because astronauts living in space have to take everything with them. So you can view it as the ultimate exercise in sustainable living. And I fully agree, getting you there might not be very sustainable, given all the fuel you need. But once you're there, that idea of a small number of people living in a constrained environment, where really you have to start thinking, the further you get from Earth, about every molecule of carbon, every molecule of nitrogen, because you're not going to be able to replace it. So today, I really want to talk about this idea of whether plants are the key, not just to surviving in this type of remote environment, but also to thriving. And that space, I'm going to maybe persuade you, hopefully, is that it can inspire us to develop a much more sustainable existence here on Earth. So just a starting point, if you were going to go and live on the International Space Station, and so the SpaceX rockets, if you wanted a kilo of anything, it costs at the moment around $2,300 to blast that 1 kilo up into space. And this is a massive improvement. The development of technologies, commercial space, has, in 1981, for example, a kilo cost around $220,000 if you adjust that for inflation. So we have made huge strides in terms of the rockets and what that costs, but it's still an enormous amount of money. And so if you think about, even without all the other things you need, just about food and supporting a crew of astronauts, that's an enormous amount that you're thinking about. But what does that food look like? So this is Koichi Wakata. He's a JAXA astronaut. He was with JAXA. He now flies with Axiom Space, who's one of the commercial space outfits. And this is him pictured with some of the food that you would eat on the International Space Station. And there's a few things I want you to kind of notice from this image. One is the color of the food. It's mostly yellow, brown, it's dehydrated. It's kind of like ration packs or camping food, not particularly appetizing, I would argue. It's also all individually packaged with a lot of plastic and a lot of waste. So if you think back to that idea, is that you are isolated, it costs money to bring all that stuff up, and now you're just going to have to throw it away, and it's essentially going to be ejected for waste to burn up in the atmosphere. And indeed, the data reflects that food isn't particularly satisfying for astronauts, because astronauts lose weight in space. So this graph just shows the dotted line is the weight at which pre-flight, and most astronauts lose weight across the mission. And these are not people who can necessarily afford to lose weight. They are kind of peak athletes. And a lot of it's been put down to the fact, this idea of menu fatigue. If you're eating very kind of boring, rehydrated food all the time, even if it's the most sort of nutritionally designed, calorie perfect meal, you will lose weight because people simply get bored of eating it. And so NASA have been thinking for a long time about how to address this issue. And plants has been an obvious solution. And humans have looked at growing plants in space for a long, long time, pretty much since we first started sending rockets up to space. Plant seeds went with us. And so plants have been grown on the ISS for the last 30 odd years, initially just to try and understand, can plants even grow in zero gravity or microgravity? They evolved in 1G. There's no reason to think they can survive up there. But actually, it turns out if you put a light above them and you put moisture below, they still send a shoot up towards the light and a root down towards the moisture, which I think is kind of a pretty awesome part of biology on its own. And so now this has developed into growing lots and lots of different plants in very small scale, 2 experimental growth facilities they have on the space station. So there's veggie, which is very simple, and the advanced plant habitat, which is more like a kind of a substandard growth chamber, very, very instrumented, very controlled. And here you've got some very happy astronauts who've grown some hatch chilies as part of a school's experiment they were doing in the advanced plant habitat. And these are genuine smiles. All the astronauts talk about the thrill of growing a plant, something that's green that you can take care of, in this very metallic and harsh environment of the space station. And they also talk about the joy of having fresh, crunchy, tasty, spicy food when you've got these kind of very mediocre dehydrated meals the rest of the time. And there's plenty of YouTube videos on the NASA channel I recommend going to have a look, of the excitement of astronauts like cheersing with leaves of rocket because they're so excited they got some fresh rocket to eat. So here's the 0G taco that astronaut Megan MacArthur made with those chilies. And they all talk about as being a highlight of their trip, which, given that they're up, flying around the Earth, I think is pretty amazing, the role that plants can have. But the International Space Station, it's only 420 kilometers above us, give or take. So in reality, that's actually not that far. It's pretty amazing that there's people living and working above us all the time these days. But if something goes wrong, if they run out of something, if there's a medical emergency, it might take a few days, but there's ways of reaching people and there's ways of fixing it. The moon, however, is 380,000 kilometers away. And the plan is that we will be returning humans to the moon with the Artemis III program, and I'll come back to a bit more about this at the end. So it's launching in September 2026, landing on the moon's south polar region. Now, there's a whole plan of work that goes beyond this. So from September 2027, maybe a bit later, there's going to be the launch of the first units of the space station Gateway, which will orbit the moon as well. So we will start to have people being able to spend time orbiting the moon. This is going to be followed by some more semi-permanent habitation on the surface of the moon before the plan is to send humans eventually out to Mars. Now, Mars is 55 million kilometers away at its closest point. It's currently 235 million kilometers away. That is remote. That means even kind of communications, audio communications have a 30-minute delay. So imagine the challenges that are required to have humans both traveling to and living and surviving and thriving that far away. And it's predicted it's going to be basically a 3-year mission. So almost a year to get out there to Mars. You would spend time there doing science and research, and then almost a year to come back. So you're talking about essentially planning for a 3-year mission. And even for a completely skeleton crew of 4 people, it's estimated that's around 10 tons of food. And while we're pretty confident that we can make the rockets necessary to get people to Mars, we are not confident how we can feed them and keep them alive. There has been comparatively little research on how that's done. So there's been talk about sort of doing food drops in advance. The problem is the calories might be stable if you say drop them on the surface of Mars through an uncrewed mission, but the vitamins are not. So the nutrition is not. We know from experiments, for example, that medication loses efficacy about 50% compared to its Earth controls, even on the International Space Station. So you can't kind of just drop a load of medication on Mars in advance and hope it's okay. There's lots of challenges we have about how we do this. So back to thinking about maybe plants are part of the solution. So how do we grow plants in the way? This is the veggie system I mentioned. It's pretty simple because one of the biggest issues in space is water movement, particularly in microgravity. Water kind of creeps about the place. On the surface of the moon and on the surface of Mars, it's actually much easier to imagine how we grow plants because they have some gravity. So it's easier to manage how water behaves. These plants, I mean, they're growing, which is great. I would say they're probably not particularly healthy. So the next question is, how do we go from being able to grow plants to growing plants in a healthy and reliable way? If you're going to rely on them for food, at the moment, they are just a nice thing to have because they're primarily experiments. But if you want people to rely on them for nutrition, it's a different story altogether. So this is a NASA artist's impression of how we might possibly grow plants in transit. And the thing I want you to note here really is that these are plants growing in tubs, under lights, on shelves. And for those of you who are plant scientists and work in kind of closed environment chambers, this looks probably like a fairly familiar setup if you've seen vertical farms. And also we've got an array of plants here. So it's not going to be a monoculture. It's equally not going to be 40 different species. So that idea of thinking about what we grow and how we grow is going to be very, very important. And then these are some, again, from NASA, artist impressions of how we might grow plants when we get there. Now, if anyone has seen The Martian, and you've seen Matt Damon growing his potatoes in kind of under a tent in his own waste, it's a nice idea, and The Martian is mostly scientifically fairly accurate. I think you're going to really struggle to grow plants in the regolith, the things that are on the surface of the planets. It's pretty nasty stuff. It's much more likely you're going to have a hydroponic, aeroponic system similar to what we would have here on Earth for growing large-scale plants in closed environment agriculture. But again, we've got this idea of plants growing in shelves under artificial lighting, perhaps either in that kind of growth module you saw, the transit module, now an on-Earth greenhouse, like you see on the right-hand side here, or on the left, sort of buried under the surface of the planet where it's giving it some protection. But to all intents and purposes, if you weren't on a red landscape, that could be images that we see here on Earth of vertical farming. And this idea of plants providing us with support and allowing us to travel to these challenging environments is not new. So this is Biosphere 2, it's an experiment in the early 1990s in the University of Arizona, where they planned to just shut some people in a greenhouse and where they would have to live and survive. This experiment went terribly wrong and was cancelled early. It's now a very, very beautiful greenhouse you can go and visit. But more recently, the Chinese lunar palace has been much more successful. So this trapped some people for a year in a sort of closed system with a large number of plants. I think it's really noticeable to think about on the left-hand side, you've got a design for this, the lunar palace, and the two major components of that are the planting areas, the vegetation cabins 1 and 2, because it's so critical that the plants survive, because they are not only giving you food, but they are also contributing to oxygen, water cleaning, so life support systems as well, versus the rest of the space given over to everything else that's going on in those activities. And then this is another example. So this is a 3D printed Mars Dune Alpha. This is built in NASA Houston, so the Johnson Space Center. So they 3D printed a habitat from something that has some analogies to the regolith you would find on the Martian surface. And they started an experiment called JAPIR, so Crew Health and Performance Exploration Analog. And this is the first team. They recently completed their year-long stay in the habitat, just the 4 of them. And they came out last month. And this was, unlike the Chinese lunar palace, this was not a closed system. But they were not interacting with any other humans. Instead, the NASA scientists kind of snuck in and out through kind of like a secret backdoor to change over experiments and test different things. So one thing they were testing was some different plant growth systems. So here on the right, you can see some of the plants that they grew. And they were documenting, this was more thinking about the psychology and interactions of humans in small teams. So kind of what I'm getting to here is that these fictional Mars habitats that NASA artists have kind of envisioned, and you'll see lots of throughout the history of science fiction, has a lot in common with, say, the vertical farms that we find on Earth now. So on the right-hand side, you can see a farm from one of our collaborators, Vertical Future. This is a farm called Science Farm in the UK. Again, we've got lots of different species growing under artificial lights. Thing to note, the goal here is that there's humans tending the plants in all of the images that we've had before. Here it's the goal of Cyan and many other vertical farms have as little human interaction with the main plant growth as possible. So here they've got sort of robots moving the plants around different shelves. And that's because labor is expensive. And this is going to be true in space. We're going to have small teams of people who will be doing lots and lots of different tasks. They will not have a large amount of time to expend on farming. And labor in the agricultural market is also a huge challenge globally right now. So anything which increases the automation or reduces the human labor is going to be probably a positive thing here. Humans are also carriers of disease, to be honest. So less human interactions means less risks of microbiology that can foodborne diseases that can cause us problems. So, and that means often less washing of and using less water in treating the plant before going to market. Also less introduction of pests, so you don't have to use pesticides and so on. So you can actually really reduce the amounts of inputs that you have to this type of farming. But the challenges are also that plants did not evolve to grow indoors, much like they didn't evolve to grow in microgravity. And while some plants do really, really well under lights or on a windowsill, and you can do these types of experiments at home, we know that things like basil and sort of watercress do pretty well. It's other types of plants really don't. So I would argue that if we are going to go to Mars and beyond, we're going to need nutrition, but we'll also need medicine and materials produced in situ. We just simply can't take them with us. And we'll need systems to purify air and waste. And that's really where the plants come in. And this is sort of underlies the Centre of Excellence in Plant for Space that Christine mentioned. And I'm the node leader for Adelaide, and we've got an amazing team of people that we get to work with on this. And our mission is, because you have to have a mission if you're a space centre, is to enable human deep space exploration and improve on-Earth sustainability through plant and food redesign. So we're funded through till 2031. So we formally started in January, and we're a centre of about $90 million in cash and in kind. But importantly, we're a virtual centre. We don't have a fancy building. We are multi-nodal. So although we're headquartered at University of Adelaide, we have people spread across other Australian universities. And in particular, we're an international collaboration. And one of the things that's very clear from space research, it's a huge challenge and also requires lots and lots of different expertise. And it's not really something that one small group of people can do alone. And so although we're a plant science focus centre, and I'd say a plant synthetic biology focus centre, we actually have a lot of expertise spread across a lot of different disciplines. And that's been really important for us to think about the whole pipeline for what we're doing. So we have 5 foundational universities at Adelaide, UWA, La Trobe, Melbourne, and Flinders. But we also collaborate with universities, particularly Berkeley and UC Davis, and Cambridge and ETH Zurich, working with the space industry and government. So NASA have been incredible partners. They've really led the way in developing how you grow plants in space. And they've been very, very generous with their expertise and willingness to be open and share, I would say. But also the Australian Space Agency and the German Space Agency, the DLR, but also the new space industries, particularly Sabre Astronautics, who are based in Adelaide, and Euro, as well as Axiom Space, who are building the new commercial space station that will replace the ISS when it's decommissioned in 2030. We're working with vertical farming companies, so Gaia and Vertical Future. This is critical because while space is a great way of thinking about these questions, and it is an industry of its own right, any impact we have on Earth is going to be reach a lot more people. And that's going to be through these industries primarily, as well as government and outreach. I'm only going to touch on this briefly, but space kind of has an opportunity to inspire like not many other things, I would argue. And it's been a really great tool for talking about so agriculture and plant science within the schools and engaging kids who might not necessarily see plant science as being relevant to them. You stick space on it, you grab their interest, but we're still talking about the same issues around sustainability and the bioeconomy.
We clearly have.
Well, and before I start this, I just want to say, one question we often get asked is, why is Australia doing this? Why isn't NASA doing this if it's so important? So I thought I'd let Colonel Pam Melroy, who's the Deputy Administrator of NASA, do the talking for me. So hopefully you can hear this okay.
We clearly have seen the extraordinary university system that Australia offers, and that's really important to us. The research that we do is the foundation of the future. So the technical activities, such as we saw plants in space at the University of Adelaide, those are the foundational investments that will support us on Moon to Mars and Artemis and going out into the solar system.
So that idea that it's going to take more than one country, it's a global endeavor to do these types of challenges, I think is really critical. So in the center, we have, so P4S, Plants for Space, we have 4 missions, which is we broadly grouped our science under. So zero waste plants optimized for controlled environments. So this is this idea that plants didn't evolve to grow inside. So it's almost like we have to rethink domestication if we're going to go beyond eating leafy greens and herbs and microgreens, which is the bulk of the kind of vertical farming industry now. And particularly thinking about waste streams. I think this is a really exciting way, and it links back to a lot of my work on thinking about biomass and converting biomass into other products, is that when you've got controlled environment agriculture, often you've got quite a dense production of quite clean streams of waste year round. So how do we use those and how do we minimize them and make sure that anything that does come out can be recycled into something valuable? Complete nutrition, plant-based foods. Space is going to be a vegan diet. On Earth, a lot of people are reducing their meat consumption, but still, want to make sure they have a highly nutritious diet. So how can we do that through plants? That on-demand bioresource production. So that's this idea that it's beyond food. What else can we make from plants? And then future-ready workforce and society. So we'll be training lots of students and postdocs and scientists ready to go out there, but also going out into the schools and talking about plants and space. So one question is, which plants should we be working on? We only formally started in January, so we are still developing some of our projects, but these are 5 of the crops that we are thinking about working on now, and I'll talk primarily only about one of them. But tomatoes and strawberries are good examples of what we call sort of pick and eat crops. They're things which are sort of tasty, kind of easy to grow, but they actually have a lot of waste at the moment. So you can eat tomato and strawberry leaves. I don't think you particularly want to, but are there ways we can make those types of parts of the plants more edible? NASA's already done some research on making low stature tomatoes that fruit for a lot longer. So can we use our knowledge of plant science to start to extend those types of activities? Water spinach and duckweed, so that's on the far left and far right, are very high protein crops that are eaten partially, but they have some anti-nutritive properties that are kind of limiting their full engagement. And then moss, not necessarily for eating, but it's a great production platform for some biochemicals. It's readily transformed, and it's another one that we're exploring. But duckweed is one of my favorites. This is duckweeds are really 36 different species of Lemnaceae. These are the smallest flowering plants on Earth. And on the top right there, you can see a collection of different plants that have come from South Australia. So lots and lots of variation, and they divide vegetatively. More importantly, they're completely edible if grown in clean water, not necessarily if you fish them out of the local pond. And they grow very fast. So they divide every 1 to 2 days, and they grow flat on the surface of the water, making them ideal for thinking about in a vertical farming situation. They're also great for outreach. This is me taking to a local class because they are really, really robust. So you can give them to kids and they can grow them at home with a lot of success. And so this just shows some of the data in the literature about them. So they have a dry weight content of about 30 to 40%, with an amino acid profile that looks very similar to pulses and to animal meat. So it has all of your amino acids, but they also contain a fair amount of fat and starch as well. So I think without sort of doing too much work, they already meet many of the conditions we were sort of looking for in our new vertical farming crops. And that gives us a basis then to go on and develop them. Tasty, I've put a question mark against. They actually have a very, very neutral flavor, which is great if you're going to go on and make them into, say, a plant-based food, because they don't have that kind of pea, bean, lentil flavor that a lot of the pulse proteins do. But it is kind of boring, so maybe there's an opportunity to expand that. And so here's some of the projects that we have got ongoing in my lab and others within the center. As I said, we are just starting up and we are in the middle of hiring people at the moment. But for example, increasing the amount of protein that we have, optimizing the vertical farming practice. These duckweeds have never been grown, to my knowledge, indoors. There is one company in Israel that's developed a bioreactor for growing them successfully. Otherwise, people have mostly farmed them outdoors in open ponds. And this has many of the same issues that we've seen with trying to grow algae outside in ponds. So we would like to kind of go for indoors where we have clean, controlled water, but that will take some optimization. We're using synthetic biology to improve dietary fiber, to introduce nutrients that perhaps are missing from a plant-based diet. So particularly we've got projects around introducing vitamin D biosynthesis and introducing animal-like omega-3 fatty acids. But as I said, we're not all plant biologists in the center. We also got people who are interested in the downstream processing. So people aren't just going to eat fresh vegetables. Some of that's going to have to be, the protein is going to be extracted to give us the right balance of some macronutrients. So how is that possible? And what's the impact on the gut of these types of novel foods? So if we're engineering foods for different purposes, what's the responses there? As well as sensory scientists and psychologists thinking about how do humans interact with these new types of foods? And then something that kind of really connects back to my former work is thinking about how plants can be used as photosynthetic production platforms. So when we talk about this transition to the bioeconomy of using renewable resources to produce our plastics, our materials, our fuels, our chemicals, a lot of that work is being done in microbes. And that means those microbes are being fed carbon from a source. And most people are using sugars, glucose, as their carbon source, which means that's coming from plants. Now, the way I see it is that there's one way of sort of reducing the complexity of that system is getting the plants to do the biomanufacturing themselves. Obviously, this can be a bit more challenging, but if you imagine you wanting simple infrastructure, and infrastructure you can use for multiple things, so growing foods and growing perhaps the plants that are going to be making your materials, then this could be a way forward. So we have projects in the center producing things like biomaterials. So for example, in my group, we're producing PHB, so biodegradable plastics inside duckweeds. We are producing nutraceuticals and pharmaceuticals. The astronauts on the space station are already taking enormous amounts of pharmaceuticals, everything from basically seasickness pills, so space sickness pills, to sleeping aids because your body clock is very, very messed up, essentially permanently jet lagged. And because of that, they're also taking caffeine pills to try and keep them alert when they need to be. And so how do we produce those types of things? And as we go further away from Earth, how do we produce those things on demand? Because we can't necessarily predict what people will need. And again, this feeds back to the thinking about how we think about supply chains and production here on Earth. I think COVID really outlined to us about some of the issues around supply chains, particularly in Australia, and the need to be able to scale up responses very, very fast. And harnessing plants to do that is certainly something that can be looked at. And again, downstream processing. And finally, TA and LCA, so techno-economic assessments and life cycle analysis. These are ways of understanding both sustainability and economics of the system. There are so many different projects you could do, so many questions you could ask. how do you know what the right one to do is? And is it really ever going to make sense? Both in space and on Earth. And that's something that we are also working very closely with engineers to think about that. Will it ever make sense to use duckweed as a production system compared to, say, a yeast-based fermentation system? And so we've got postdocs who are working on that. And so this all links back to this idea of CEA. Closed environment agriculture is the broad sense of, or the broad term for any sort of agriculture which is in an enclosed environment, through to vertical farming, which is the most controlled version of it. So why is this relevant? Well, space innovation has produced many, many things that we use here on Earth today. There's Tech Briefs is the NASA output of all the different types of technology that have come from space research. And they range from the camera in your smartphone, through to solar cells, to LASIK eye surgery, to the paint that's on the Statue of Liberty that prevents corrosion, including the LEDs that we use as grow lights. They were first tested by NASA as a way of thinking about how they could grow plants on the space station. And then, that technology came back to Earth, and it was commercialized and used widely, in particular by, say, the cannabis industry. And now it's a feature of most of our growth rooms and sort of home growth systems as well. And so it's this idea of using that innovation of space and that sort of inspiration of space, where you have to solve a problem. You have to solve a problem with the components that you have and the restrictions you have on energy, on water, on carbon and nitrogen as we go further and further away from Earth. And so we would really like to use this as a way of inspiring us to sort of do better and be a bit more creative about our solutions. And closed environment agriculture will require most of those features we talked about as we had in our space crops. So being healthy and tasty, fast growing, low waste, using few resources, and producing multiple foods from the same system. So I think we can draw a very tight connection between the two. And so we've now built, this is at University of Adelaide, this is my undergraduate student, Charlotte, growing some lettuce in the farm. So we have a mini vertical farm. It's actually built by Vertical Futures, our commercial collaborator. They never built a farm so small because it's only 2-meter runs, five canals in a run. So about 10 meters growth space in total. But we are using it to be able to do that scale up from lab to vertical farm. I think many of us who've worked in plant science for a while have known the challenges of doing field trials on our engineered crops. We spend a long time in the lab developing new crops. You do glasshouse trials, and then you go out into the field, you do multiple field trials, and you get multiple phenotypes back. The beauty of working in a controlled environment is that we have a fixed environment we're designing for. And that means the experiments in the lab can be put into this system. We can do some fairly rigorous testing. And by the time we go to commercial partners, we can be pretty confident of the phenotype that we're getting out. And given how hard it is still to do genetic engineering in a predictable manner, particularly some more complex genetic engineering, it means we have to do less of that kind of understanding how the environment impacts with the genetics. We can kind of focus on the genetics, which is a bit of a cop-out, I understand, but it's a way of dealing with a huge challenge. And so here you can see growing some of the plants we're working on. Lettuce, this is a version of lettuce that NASA uses a lot on the International Space Station. So we use it as kind of a helpful baseline for understanding growth. And on the right, you can see feverfew. This is a crop that produces an anti-cancer drug that can't be synthesized using organic chemistry, or hasn't been yet. And we're testing, it can be grown in the field, but it means the yields are very, very variable because, again, environment affects the output of this particular compound. So we're growing it in the vertical farm in a new project to see if we can get very defined amounts of this compound out. And happens to be not only an anti-cancer drug, this is a collaboration with the lab of Professor Chris Sweeney. It turns out to be a radioprotective drug at the same time. So it protects healthy cells from radiation, which of course could be very useful in space. And I think for a long time, vertical farming and even a lot of this kind of biomanufacturing was considered a fairly small market. Perhaps places like Singapore, where land is in very, very short supply. But I think as climate change is having greater impacts, There's a large interest in other countries, including Australia, and Australia is a huge growing market for closed environment agriculture as a way of dealing with the variation that we're seeing in climate. And so it's not going to replace broadacre farming or anything like that, but it's a supplement that gives some robustness and resilience to the food sector, but perhaps particularly for remote communities. And the US in particular has been leading. There was a presidential decree on the bioeconomy. There's a large amount of research going into that, and there's a lot of discussion in Australia about how we can start to develop this market too. Now, just in my final few minutes, one of the questions I get asked maybe quite often is, okay, you've talked a lot about plants to space, but are you guys actually going to send any plants to space, or is this all talk? And within the centre itself, we obviously didn't want to use, we didn't have the support or use our research funds for actually sending plants up to space. So we've been very fortunate already that we've been able to get some additional research funds. And so we have a couple of projects. So one is funded by the UK Space Agency and the Australian Space Agency, where we are developing an autonomous agriculture system to go on Axiom Station. So if you remember, I said that Axiom Station is going to be the new commercial space station that replaces the ISS. And their countries are they see themselves having lots more people living and working in space who are not, retired Air Force pilots. These are going to be people who have lots of other skills, but perhaps might be more fussy about what they want to eat or need some more healthy diets to support them. And so they want to have a growth system that actually provides food to the people who are living and working on their space station. And so we're developing that, but they want it to be as autonomous as possible because astronaut time is so valuable. So we're trying to understand how much we can identify plant stress early and do early interventions, either autonomously through using machine vision and AI, or having remote human interventions from here on Earth. The second project is an iLaunch project to send plants up to the ISS, just to see how they grow and to see if we can link that plant stress we're doing in the autonomous agriculture. Can we actually do some testing on the ISS in person, so we can bring those two strands together? But the third project that I'm pretty excited about, I would say, is a new project. So it's NASA funded. So we're part of a team. So Space Lab Technologies are a company based in Colorado. They are partners on Plants to Space, and they are leads on an Artemis III deployed instrument called LEAF for lunar effects on agricultural flora. And what this means is that when humans return to the moon, and hopefully in 2026, they're going to take 3 experiments and put them on the surface of the moon. And one of them is going to be ours. So my group and Matt Lucy at La Trobe, who's another P4S CI, are part of this. And that instrument in the bottom corner is the LEAF payload. And it's going to do the first assessment of how plants germinate and grow on the moon. But excitingly, they're going to bring samples back. So both Matt and I are going to be able to do analysis of these seeds that have been germinated and grown on the moon, just to get the first idea of how they respond to that lunar gravity and to the radiation that they're going to experience. And plants that are growing, that are going to go on the moon, are going to be the duckweed that I talked about, our favorite Arabidopsis, but also Brassica rapa, which is a fast cycling plant. And all 3 of these plants have got some space heritage, which means they've been grown in space before. And so we can sort of compare the impact of them growing in sort of microgravity versus how they do go into the moon. I think these are just the first steps of really understanding what this is going to look like in the future. I couldn't do all this without a quick advert. So we are recruiting lots of people at the moment. That QR code will take you to our website, which is currently very basic, but should be getting much more detail the next few days. But we're looking for masters and PhD students, postdocs, engagement officers, administration staff. At all the nodes, there are positions open. So please get in touch if you want to know more. And we are particularly open to interns and staff student exchanges. It's a big question, and I think there's lots of different aspects of plant science that can be explored here. So we're very, very open to collaboration. So with that, I'd just like to say, I think plants and an effective ability by us to harness their chemistry are going to be key to that successful transition for bioeconomy And that it's really been underpinned, our ability to even consider this, I think, to such a huge extent, by these advances in agricultural biotech, so gene editing, our ability to develop gene circuits and control gene expression have really moved on, although I think there's still mountains to do before we can do it in a really predictable way, particularly outside of, say, Arabidopsis. That space can be used as a lens for innovating for sustainable closed environment agriculture here on Earth. And that I think CA is a really promising environment for year-round predictable production of engineered crops, but also other crops too. But I think there's going to be a large amount of interplay between horticulture and engineering before it's really scalable and economically viable. And with that, I want to say thank you to my lab. I have a fabulous lab that I've been building recently here since I moved to Australia a couple of years ago in Adelaide. I also have a small lab in Berkeley. There's now 2 postdocs who are finishing up some projects over there. They've been very patient with me while I moved to the other side of the planet. And to the Plants for Space team, particularly Matt Gilliam, the director, but all the CIs on it. And I particularly want to thank Joy Massa, who is now head of the Plant Sciences group at Kennedy Space Center, for her generosity and advice as we've been getting things set up. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Hi, Jenny. That was beautiful. Thank you very much.
No problems.
Really enjoyed that. Are there any questions from the audience first? Ali, go ahead, Ali. If you can ask a question, that'd be great. Just got the mute issue.
Yeah. Can you hear me now? Oh.
Yes.
Yes. Cool.
That's better.
Yeah, thanks for the talk, Jenny. That was really interesting. And I was very happy to see the shout out to duckweed, because I did some outreach with high school kids who were excited to make duckweed smoothies for all of their classmates. But I was wondering in the context of the centre, if you're thinking about like not just sort of engineering plants, but also engineering environments. Like you mentioned that the sort of the micro or zero gravity environments, particularly for the sort of, the journeys between different planets is challenging, but having seen sci-fi movies where you'll sort of have big spinning parts of a ship that can create artificial gravity, are there sort of considerations like that about what mechanical things or structural things need to be in place to support the plants, as well as adapting plants to those environments?
Absolutely. And I say one of the really fun things about this project and the challenge is that, and this actually applies not just on space, but to vertical farming, is that tight interaction between engineering and horticulture and plant science expertise, is that you need both people working together. It's a very iterative process of thinking about how you design that environment. You can't do one without the other. In terms of the spinning stuff, I think that's really technically very challenging, but I think there are other ways of thinking about how do we design, and that's part of this UK Space Agency grant we have, is how do we design a growth facility for the ISS, because there's lots of weird challenges. One is like how water moves, but also you're designing into a 3D space. So you don't just need plants to grow up, you can grow plants in very different configurations. And at least my human brain really struggles with that spatial concept of what's the best way. Like, would you have a central column of plants with kind of lights around the outside, or vice versa? Because we can make use of that physical space more often because you're not constrained by gravity. So yeah, there's lots of sort of questions, I think, around that. And that's one of those fun discussions. You can also fall down rabbit holes of like, oh, should we even be talking about this as a first strategy? I don't know. But I think that's one of the things we can start to do.
Yeah, thanks.
We've got a question from the chat. Hi Jenny, I come from a plant pathology background. Do you think there are any risks of a high disease incidence in a closed intensive growing system like vertical farming? Yeah, it's a good question, because I'm assuming everyone gets sort of doused with antimicrobial things or something before.
Yeah, it's a really important question, actually. And so I'll do the space version first, is that NASA are completely paranoid about everything going up being super sterile. The problem is humans, of course, are walking petri dishes of bugs. So there's no way it can be sterile. And so the space station is kind of riddled now with microbes, including what they're now determining are probably new species because of the radiation load means the mutations that have arisen. Right. And so in particular, they found that there's been bugs which have been colonizing plants. These are bugs which are not pathogenic here on Earth, but because essentially they've got a completely empty ecological niche to colonize, they've been able to act pathogenically on the plants. And so there's a lot of concern about how do we manage that. So people have talked about perhaps using synthetic communities, so having a sort of sterile seed set, but then you inoculate some kind of neutral pathogens that can block those ecological niches. But it's how do you manage that? And NASA's very concerned about introducing microbes. On Earth, similar questions arise, right? If you have a completely sterile environment, you're just asking to be infested by something.
Yes.
So a lot of the vertical farms now go for very, very sterile. They have very clean HVAC systems. It's very, very clean. But a lot of them are looking at ways of, that's expensive to manage. And you just need one bug to sneak in and suddenly you're off to the races. So there's a lot of interest again in thinking about, it doesn't necessarily have to be plant growth promoting, but even in a sort of neutral way that is controllable might be a way of exploring this, because again, concerns about microbiological safety are really critical. So yeah, we don't have any pathology in this. We decided that we had to draw kind of a line somewhere, but we've got some of our collaborators in the US are certainly interested in this, but I think it's a huge space to explore.
Well, thanks for your question, Kiwi. That was really good. Another one from Mohammed Bashir. Ahmed, and with materials develop. Yes, he's saying he's got a materials development background in plants. Are there any possibilities for plant sorry, I can't quite see it, bioelectron study in space using natural biomaterials?
Bioelectronic study. So by that, do you mean making kind of things like conducting materials out of plants or yeah, okay. This is not so much my area of expertise, but there has been some work on things like using combining plant material with other materials to make new forms of conductance. I think in general, there's a lot to be done in that material science, plant science kind of crossover space. There's very little people, I think there's very few people who are really working at that interplay, because you need quite a lot of expertise to get that done. But I'm particularly very interested in how you can manipulate polysaccharides to have different properties. And I'd be, very keen to explore that further, because I definitely don't have an electronics background. Yes, I know Volker. So Volker is a CI. He's here at Adelaide, who's working on lots of this. Volker and I have many projects together. Yeah, it's a huge space, I think, for exploring, not just space, but, research area. There we go.
And Charlie Gray's sort of putting his hand up, wondering whether it's a big good area to do a PhD. I think the answer's pretty obvious.
I'm going to be a bias and say yes. But I think in general, the skills that you would learn in this type of area, and I say this, my PhD was in fundamental plant physiology and calcium signaling and arabidopsis, right? But my postdoc was looking at understanding plant cell wall biosynthesis at a time when it was considered like a fairly niche question. And then suddenly biofuels became of interest because oil got sort of very high in value, and there was something became a big industry ask about how we can manipulate plants and how we can understand them. And I think that's only grown as we try and think about all those different aspects of the bioeconomy that plants are going to touch. So I think more broadly, this idea of understanding plants, because we can't effectively use them until we can understand their biology. I think it goes hand in hand. You have to have the fundamental discovery to go with the application.
Yeah, I echo that for sure. That's a very important point.
Yeah.
Sue Ma was just asking about whether reproducing plants in space conditions will be a focus.
Yes, a little bit. So obviously mimicking microgravity is the hardest part, and my kind of Weasley get out is that on the moon and Mars you would have some gravity, which means, and the water behavior and and air movement are the two hardest parts, because on the space station there's no convection, which means things like any volatile hormones kind of sit on the surface near the leaf. So, but they've just solved that by introducing fans. The water movement is much harder to deal with. You can mimic microgravity here on Earth. There's lots of different ways, from building a very simple clinostat. You can do it with like a Raspberry Pi, and we do that a lot Or there's like Boeing have built these random positioning machines that are meant to be much better at mimicking microgravity that cost loads, thousands and thousands of dollars. However, I don't think biology fully falls for these mimics of microgravity. And so one of the questions is, how well are we really mimicking it when we're doing that? And so I think there's a lot to be done from, as commercial space is getting cheaper and more accessible for doing research, more and more experiments being done. And there's a lot of work that's currently being done to collate that data and try and understand it at a large scale, because at the moment, a lot of it's anecdotal. And I think we're beginning to rethink about that. Other than that, we see the vertical farm as a pretty good replication of everything else. So I think it's going to be a mixture. And I think sometimes we just have to accept there's some things we can't mimic too well. And sort of that's one of the ones we're going to send the experiments into space for.
Yep. There's another student reaching out to you, and I'll just say, look, there's probably a lot of students on this who's been watching or who might watch in the future, and I'd just say reach out directly to Jenny with any questions you have, or I'm sure you enthusiastically embrace anyone who's vaguely interested in this area, because there's so many options, aren't there, of things you could go, directions you could take. Opportunities are pretty endless, and as you said, you've got that connection to industry, but you've also got the fundamental science, so that's really cool. So that was Kim Perry, just wanting to reach out there. Well, we've only got two minutes left, so I see Liz Gillum's got her hand up. Maybe we'll finish with that, and thank you.
Hi, Jenny. Thanks for a really inspiring seminar. I was just interested in the way that you're proposing to cover the pharmaceuticals that you might need in space. I mean, if you want to grow individual plants, you could bring up the seeds for feverfew and whatever and produce on demand. But there's an awful lot of drugs with different sort of chemical scaffolds. How are you planning to sort of deal with the diversity of drugs that you might need in space to be produced on demand?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And we have a few ways we've been thinking about this. And honestly, I would say in transit, you would hope to have most things with you, but it's more about those long-term habitations is where we're thinking about it. And there'd be two ways. One is that there are certain scaffolds we could probably predict, so opioid type scaffolds. And by using sort of genetic circuitry, so Ryan Lister in particular has been doing some beautiful work on how do we tightly control expression. So you can imagine one seed might have constructs that under certain conditions can use multiple compounds. But I think long-term, we see it almost that DNA synthesis is getting pretty facile. So the first DNA synthesis, they haven't synthesized DNA on the space station yet, but it's in process of getting something up there. They can do DNA synthesis in situ. So if you can do sort of facile plant transformation and DNA synthesis, I would imagine that all the sort of design, build, test, learn component is done here on Earth. And then you sort of transmit a DNA blueprint digitally to solve a problem. And then by having very rapid responding plants, so I would say duckweed, but choose your quick plant of choice, you could imagine producing something relatively fast in situ as needed there. So that would mean that on Earth, you would need, one, to have a really good understanding of what you need and how to produce it. And so that really comes back to being better at predicting how we can introduce metabolic pathways and how we can be sure that we get very defined outputs, because particularly medication, that's when you start to be concerned about off-target compounds, dosage, thinking about processing. People have always had this nice idea you could produce something in a plant leaf and eat it, and that solves your problem, right? And it's a lovely, intuitive kind of idea, but there's so many reasons why that is challenging, for stability, for dosage, all these things. And so that's where the downstream processing is really critical. And Sally Grass, who's one of the professors, and in all my other centers around bioeconomy, the chemical engineers are in your ear constantly about, have you thought about downstream processing and separations? And if not, go away and think about it again, because that's going to be really critical. So finding out how we can do that simply, and that has impacts here in the bioeconomy on Earth too, because it's not going to be like having massive biorefineries where you have large chemical infrastructure and do all this sort of different fractionation and cracking. We want fairly straightforward, simple, small scale procedures we can do for a lot of things. So I think working with chemical engineers and biologists together, we can solve that. I don't think it's a solved problem. Even
That's a big one. Well, thanks for your question, Liz, and thanks so much, Jenny, for that presentation. I feel I have a really good understanding of the centre now, and I can see why you're getting so much enthusiasm and attention. It's just fantastic. So, yeah, thanks and congratulations to you and the team, and we'll hopefully keep in touch.
Absolutely. Thank you. And thank you very much for the invite. As I said, we started in January, so hopefully, we can come back maybe in a few years and tell you a bit more about the science or something.
Yeah, well, I hope we'll keep in touch before then.
Absolutely.
Oh, all the best. Yeah, thanks very much. Really appreciate it. Okay, bye.